How does one begin to introduce the topic of missing and murdered Aboriginal women? Mothers, daughters, sisters, friend. These are the things we must remember. Perhaps the most important finding we made in our research was the disproportionate number of Aboriginal women compared to non-Aboriginal women being murdered. The reasons for that are many and go back a long time. The context of Aboriginal women is very unique. When we look at colonialism, we look at the loss of culture, the loss of land, and for women, they lost their position. They lost a lot of power. Laws that were imposed meant things would be even more vulnerable. So when they got divorced, for example, having no ownership of land, there was no divorce with some type of settlement or something like that. And education has been a problem for a long time, and residential schools was part of that. So fitting in has been difficult. Being able to participate in commerce, being able to really enjoy and take pride in culture. And racism, separation of the cultures. Those are key issues. I think it's fair to say that the Native Women's Association of Canada brought the issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women to the forefront. It was them that really spearheaded a report that brought the RCMP accountable to do some of their own study. And no question that there was some clarification that occurred, and the numbers were not quite the same. But what was really evident is that it was a disproportionate number, that Aboriginal women were being killed 7 times higher than non-Aboriginal. In our research, we really discovered that British Columbia was the worst province in Canada in terms of missing and murdered Aboriginal women, and the two places, the Highway of Tears and the Vancouver East Side District, were the places where the largest concerns were. When we took a look at the Vancouver East Side District, it was evident that the women that were being killed were part of the sex trade, and they were very vulnerable, and it wasn't really clear in terms of how these women could be helped. One of the questions that came out from that was whether or not, if prostitution was legalized, if somehow that would make them less vulnerable, safer, and so that was the topic we initially chose to study. Canada doesn't have any history of legalized prostitution, so we weren't able to really contrast something in Canada to sort out whether or not, if it was legalized, it would somehow create safer conditions. So we decided to take a look at Australia, because Australia has a very similar history in terms of colonization and Aboriginal issues, and thought that might be a good place, as there are districts in Australia that were illegal and now are legal. And so that's where we began to research. Although we didn't actually conduct the study, it was really clear from our research that both in Canada and in Australia, it was difficult to get a clear picture of the relationship between murder, and prostitution, because the question of the vocation, if you want to call it that, really wasn't being asked consistently, and so there was lots of stats on murder, but understanding whether or not these women were involved in prostitution was problematic, as well as different cultures, different ideas on what prostitution was, and the laws were defined a little bit differently, and so the contrasting the two was problematic. By the time we reached the qualitative study, speaking for myself, I know that I had my fill of the violence and the atrocity that's been perpetuated on Aboriginal women. At that point, we really wanted to take a look at the strengths and decided to take a look at how they're resisting oppression. So the question was, how are vulnerable Aboriginal women living in East Vancouver resisting oppression? And we were particularly interested in seeing if there's any cultural strengths that could be pulled from that. There were a lot of considerations when we looked at the participatory action research model when it came to working with Aboriginals. It was a really good opportunity at that point to involve the community and involve elders, follow some of the practices that are suggested in the Tri-Council. We wanted to take a look at different kinds of narratives, whether it was a written narrative or oral or dance or something like that, where people were resisting, where people were finding strength in their culture. And so we involved a number of different community partners in that, and went from there. It's hard to know what kind of information would have come out of that study. What was clear is that we needed to be really cognizant of confidentiality and being sensitive of any sort of cultural sensitivities. And given that the nature of the issues that we're exploring, it would be critical that we consult with elders and we consult with the community in terms of where that information is going to be going, and how that information, and if that information would be disseminated, and where the recommendations for the future would be. This research activity provided a lot of learning. I think for myself, I gained a lot in exploring the history and the context of the Aboriginal nations. Brittany and I certainly learned a lot about ethics and managing information. And the different approaches offered a lot of unique learning. The quantitative approach was challenging because we had to define variables, and inside of that it was a lot of learning. The qualitative approach offered a real advantage to the community and involving people, and could see a lot of benefit in it, and a very different approach, something that I think that would work well for this particular group. All in all, it was good.